Chapter 11, Decision Making and Relevant Information, Part 3. Okay, so far, even though we've done 2 whole presentations, we haven't gotten through much of this, but this decision-making process, relevant from irrelevant information, is important. Make sure you understand that. This stuff is always on exams. The concept of opportunity cost, and now we're going to look at the capacity constraints, bottlenecks, adding or dropping customers. These are equipment replacement decisions, and then finally a little bit about conflict. So a capacity constraint means that managers must choose to use resources for one thing and forego using them for something else. Okay, that is a capacity constraint. And product mix decisions are decisions managers make about which products to sell and in what quantities. Okay, so the decision rule is that you choose the product that produces the highest contribution margin per unit of the constraining resource. Okay, so not the highest contribution margin per unit of product, but the highest contribution margin per unit of the constraint. And here's an example. We've got 2 products. Here's our selling price, variable cost. Contribution margin for product B is a lot higher. Contribution margin ratio, 40%, 50%. Product A requires a half an hour per unit. Product B requires 3 hours. Okay, so the contribution margin per machine hour, if that's a constrained resource, is $8 for product A and $5 for product B. So in this example, a manager must choose how much of product A and B to sell. And machine hours are limited, and that's your constraining resource. Therefore, according to the decision rule, we'll take the product that maximizes the contribution margin per unit of the constraining resource. So looking at the contribution margin by product, the obvious choice would be B, since it has a $15 margin per unit compared to $8 for product A. However, B requires 3 hours of machine hours versus only a half hour for product A. So this type of decision usually has a short-run focus because they typically arise in the context of capacity constraints that can be relaxed in the long run. Whoops. Okay. So contribution margin per unit of the constrained resource. Okay. So in 3 hours, we make $5 here, and in 3 hours, we would make, so we've got 6 of these, right? It would make like $48, a lot more. So a bottleneck is a phenomenon where the performance or capacity of an entire system is limited by a single or a limited number of components or resources. And the term bottleneck is taken from assets are water metaphor. As water is poured out of a bottle, the rate of outflow is limited by the width of the conduit of exit. Okay, so that's the bottleneck. But by increasing the width of the bottleneck, one can increase the rate at which water flows out of the neck at different frequencies. Okay, so such limiting components of a system are sometimes referred to as bottleneck points, and these are important to people in operations analysis. Okay, so the theory of constraints describes methods to maximize operating income when faced with some bottleneck and some non-bottleneck operations. In the top, the theory of constraints defines these 3 measures. First of all, throughput margin, then investments, and operating costs. And the objective of the theory of constraints is to increase throughput margin while decreasing investments and operating costs. And the theory of constraints focuses on managing bottleneck operations. So the 4 steps to manage a bottleneck is to recognize that bottlenecks determine the contribution margin of the entire system. Okay, identify the bottleneck operations, keep the bottleneck operation busy, and subordinate all non-bottleneck operations to the bottleneck. So in other words, everything that it takes to keep the bottleneck moving, keep that open is where the focus is in the operation. And then finally, take access to increase the efficiency and capacity of the bottleneck operation. So what you do is you identify a bottleneck right here in your system, and you work on the bottleneck to open it up. Then you look at the whole system and find the next bottleneck. So you go from one to the next until you've really improved the capacity of the system. Now, customer profitability and relevant costs. If the cost object is a customer, managers have to decide about adding or dropping a customer. Okay, and the question again is, does adding or dropping a customer add operating income to the firm? If the person, adds income, don't drop. If they don't add. Okay, and the decision is based on incremental income of the customer, not how much revenue the customer generates. In this example, the company faces a question of whether or not they should drop customer Whisk. Okay, we've got a loss here, who appears to have a negative impact on operating income. They are considering dropping a customer, Laurel, who would have the same revenues and costs as WIC, plus the requirement of additional equipment with $9,000 in depreciation. Where's this guy? Where's Whisk? Okay. Rent, general administrative costs, and total corporate office costs will not change. So these three, so general administration, corporate office costs, we've got depreciation here someplace. Okay, $9,000 of depreciation that's in here. Okay, this must be it. Okay. These numbers, so rent, where's rent? Rent, $14,000. That won't change either. Okay, so what should the company do? Do you know what? This is worked out on the side. We're going to have to look at this separately. It'll be, it's a PDF that's just below this file. Okay? So when a customer doesn't produce positive operating income, managers should attempt to determine why. And it might be because they've got low margin products or high sales order costs. That's a real problem. Or high delivery processing and other handling costs. All right, there are some people that use up like all the time in all these support operations, for one reason or another. They might have high marketing costs. And once identified, a manager would work with the customer to reduce these costs so they can become more profitable. So on this slide, we discuss a critical distinction between the relevant costs of adding versus dropping a customer. And there's at least one critical distinction. Depreciation cost is irrelevant in deciding whether to drop a customer because depreciation on equipment that has already been purchased is a past or a sunk cost. Okay, but the cost of purchasing new equipment in the future that would be written off as depreciation would be relevant in deciding whether to add a customer. Sometimes companies have to decide about closing or adding branch offices or business divisions, and this analysis is similar to the process of adding or closing a customer with one notable exception. Frequently, branches or divisions are allocated a share of corporate office costs. And if a branch or division is closed, these costs may be allocated differently, but they may not actually change. Sometimes maybe a little bit will change if they've lost a manager, but most of the time those costs just get allocated across the remaining divisions. Now throughout the chapter, they talked about past historical or sunk costs being irrelevant to decision making, and that's because a decision cannot change something that's already happened. And we can now apply the same concept to decisions about replacing equipment. We stress that, remember, the book value, original cost minus accumulated depreciation, that's a past cost, and it's irrelevant. What might matter, though, is if you can sell the old machine. Okay, if you can sell it and you've got a disposal value, that would be relevant. If you're replacing the machine, the cost of the new machine will be relevant. Now we'll go over all this in sample problems for the chapter, okay? So what you might want to do is work the problems and then come back and take a look at this again. But this is really a problem-based chapter. So despite the quantitative nature of some aspects of decision making, not all managers will choose the best alternative for the firm. They're going to consider how the company will judge their performance after the decision is implemented. And many managers consider it unethical to take actions to make their own performance look good when these actions are not in the best interest of the firm. So the decision model analysis, step 4, can dictate one decision, but in the real world, would the manager really allow it? An important factor is the manager's perception of whether the decision model is consistent with how the company will judge his or her performance after it's implemented. All right, and you can understand it's only natural that somebody would care about how something was going to reflect on them. So regarding this step 4, and the example in the book, the decision would be to replace a machine. However, an important factor in replacing decisions is the manager's perception of whether or not the decision model is consistent with how he or she will be judged, how their performance will be judged. Okay, and you'd be surprised how frequently these things are opposed to each other. Okay, so we've got a couple slides here with different terms on it that you might want to take a look at. That might be helpful. There are 2 slides, okay, with page references. Okay, I'll see you in the problems.